Imagine this. You're a war veteran, a survivor of Gallipoli, standing under the brutal Western Australian sun in 1932. You've traded your trenches for wheat fields. You're broke and your land is barely usable, and now you're holding a Lewis machine gun. Why? Because a 6-foot tall bird just stared you down and dared you to shoot first. Welcome to Naked History, where we rip off the fig leaf off the past to reveal the absurd, the extraordinary, and the utterly feather-brained. I'm your host, Dylan Gassaway, and today we're diving into a moment so surreal it sounds like a Monty Python sketch crossed with a military after-action report. The Great Australian Emu War. Yes, it really happened. Yes, they did use machine guns. And yes, the birds won. Let's get into it, shall we? Between 1914 and 1918, Australia dispatched more than 330,000 soldiers overseas to fight in the Great War, now known as World War I. After the 1918 armistice ended the fighting, the Australian government instituted a program to provide free farming land to its returning soldiers in order to reintroduce them back into civilian life. In Western Australia, the government established 48 farming estates totaling almost 90,000 hectares, or just a little over 200,000 acres, in the area northeast of Perth, in the southwest corner of the nation. This land became known as the Wheat Belt, but its inland location meant the area had limited water and was barely arable, a condition that worsened to the east as the bush melted into the massive interior desert known as the Outback. Even so, many as 5,000 returning soldiers accepted the Australian government's offer and settled down in the Wheat Belt to begin their new lives as farmers. During the 1920s, about a third of the soldier settlers failed or just gave up, while those who lasted learned to diversify their commodities. For example, planting wheat while also raising sheep, so that if the price of one commodity dropped, they could still buoy their finances on the other until the prices had recovered. In that way, the Australian farmers protected themselves against downturns in the fluctuating markets. In 1929, Australian election results propelled Labour Party leader James Scullin to the post of Prime Minister. He was sworn into that position on October 22, 1929, and 2 days later, before his cabinet was entirely in place, the Wall Street stock market began to crash. The resulting Great Depression caused all commodity prices to plummet worldwide. Looking forward to the following year, Prime Minister Scullin encouraged Australian farmers to grow more wheat, and in order to support their plight, he proposed the Wheat Marketing Bill to the Australian Senate in order to guarantee the farmers at a minimum price for their 1930 crop. Encouraged by the bill and his promises, farmers began following this advice. However, when the global wheat price then plummeted in June of 1930, the Australian Senate rejected Scullin's bill and the two other attempts to later pass similar proposals, and Australian farmers, including the soldier settlers of the Wheat Belt, faced the prospect of an enormous financial loss. In an attempt to ride out the downturn, Australian farmers stored most of their wheat, hoping the price would rebound by harvest time. It did not, and the farmers finally and begrudgingly accepted the rock-bottom prices rather than let their wheat rot away in the silos. Scullin's gambit had failed, and the farmers paid the price. In 1931, Prime Minister Scullin finally passed a fourth attempt at a relief bill through the Senate, but his efforts were too late. In that year's elections, his Labour Party suffered a very convincing defeat to the United Australia Party, led by the former Tasmanian Prime Minister Joseph Lyons. Lyons, who had previously served as treasurer under Scullin, passionately opposed interventionist policies. Immediately upon accepting the post of Prime Minister, once more canceled Scollon's relief bill. Wheat farmers now were suffering a second disastrous year, and having lost confidence in either ruling party, forced a shutdown with the government by agreeing amongst themselves to refuse to ship their 1932 harvest until they received fair prices for their wheat. Simultaneously, an act of bold defiance and a tremendous financial risk on the part of the desperate, struggling farmers. On the semi-arid eastern edge of the wheat belt, the soldier settlers of the Campion district were among those who prepared to make this drastic statement. The farmers there had invested heavily in wheat since the stock market crashed, and farms there were an average of about 3,000 acres in size, about half of which was cleared for farming. And plans were underway to build 2 new grain elevators in the central town of Wagalan. The area was also constantly struggling against pests and vermin. In the 19th century, English settlers artificially introduced non-native rabbits to Australia in order for the aristocracy to have familiar hunting targets. The rabbits, being rabbits, bred wildly, and soon hordes of the hopping and munching critters devastated the local crops, promoting the government to take action. In 1907, construction began on the first of 3.5-foot tall, so-called rabbit-proof fences, bisecting the country from north to south and protecting much of the Western Australian farms from the plagues of rabbits, while providing a barrier to dingoes and foxes as well. The fence, however, ran just west of Wagoolan and the Campion district, meaning that soldier settlers there learned to accept the animals as a fact of life. They would soon learn, however, that the rabbits, dingoes, foxes, and the rest of the dangers of whatever was in Australia was not the plague that they needed to fear the most. Among the other unusual animals, Australia is home to the emu, the second largest bird in the world behind only the ostrich. Emus are shaggy, long-necked, flightless birds that can stand as tall as a human and weigh as much as 130 pounds. With football-shaped bodies covered in shaggy brown and gray feathers and balanced atop long, powerful legs. Their Latin name, Dromaeus novae hollandii, roughly translates now to Australian sprinter, as they can reach over 40 miles per hour in a dead run while flapping their useless wings for balance. Emus are also well adapted to living in the arid climate of the outback on account of their ability to survive long stretches of time without water, although they then drink extensive amounts when offered the chance. They generally migrate in the autumn, heading roughly from northeast to southwest in search of water, but they are notoriously unpredictable in the speed and distance which they travel, and in the number of birds that will make the journey at once. Despite the emu now being a symbol of the country, its image appears on the Australian coat of arms. The government had declared them pests in 1922 due to the threat they posed to the wheat crop, and instituted a bounty system for farmers, paying a set amount for each emu bill received. In 1932, as the farmers daringly withheld their wheat crop in protest, an unusually large migration of about 20,000 emus invaded the approximately 40-square-mile area of the Campion district, a density that averaged to about 500 birds per square mile. Although emus could, and occasionally did, step over or tear down sections of the fence to the west, the birds largely saved themselves the effort and remained in the area around Wagalan, where there was plenty of wheat to eat and water to drink. The Campion farmers, desperate to retain their 1932 harvest, not only for income but for leverage against the government, tried bounty hunting for the emus, but sheer numbers overwhelmed their ability to deter or thin the invading flocks. Some enterprising local boys in the Wagalan area hopped on their bicycles and tried riding down the emus, swatting birds in the head with sticks as they sped by, reportedly killing as many as 27 in one day. Farmers also tried hiring a local motorist to attempt the same tactic, pursuing the emus in his truck as townspeople swung clubs while perched on his running boards, but the vehicle's engines frightened the birds and the exercise was deemed too costly. The emus persisted, and perhaps became even more wary of humans as a result of the townspeople's effort. One of the Campion soldier settlers by the name of Dixon remembered in his time of service and floated the idea among his fellows. Soon thereafter, some of the local farmers, it's unclear exactly who, compiled and sent a letter to Sir George Pierce, Minister of Defense in Perth, and requested the deployment of modern weapons, specifically machine guns, in order to contain the Emu menace. Pierce discussed the prospect with the Commandant of the 5th Military District, Brigadier A.M. Martin, who agreed on the viability of the plan, mentioning that the exercise could serve as an effective training for his men against fast-moving targets. One of the two, probably Pierce, also noted the potential opportunity for positive propaganda in order to show the Australian farmers that the Lyons administration was actively helping in their plight. The two men consulted the local society for the prevention of cruelty to animals, who supported the idea as long as their inspectors could verify that the animals were treated humanely and not allowed to suffer. Pierce saw the plan as both beneficial and practical, so without notifying his superiors in the distant national capital of Canberra, he informed the farmers of the Campion district that they would have their assistance, providing the machine guns would be manned by professional soldiers trained in their use, and the farmers would provide all lodging, food, and ammunition. The Farmers' Agricultural Bank agreed to front the government for the ammunition to be repaid out to the farmers' future profits, and provided a reassurance towards any damage caused during the operation. Colonel Hode of the Australian Light Horse, hearing of the plan, placed an order for 1,000 feathered emu skins in order to make plumage for his horsemen's iconic hats. The expedition was underway. Brigadier Martin appointed Major J.P.W. Meredith, commander of the 7th Heavy Battery in Perth, to lead the mission in Campion. Major Meredith mobilized 2 of his machine gunners, Sergeant McMurray and Gunner O'Halloran, along with a pair of Lewis light machine guns. The Lewis was an American design produced in England and used heavily in World War I. Gas-operated but air-cooled, it was used during the war both on the ground and while mounted on airplanes. It was about half the weight of the English Vickers machine gun and fired 500 to 600 rounds per minute from its single barrel, although the limited size of the magazine required reloading after 96 rounds fired. The Lewis machine gun's effective range was recorded as 880 yards, although its bullets could reach 4 times that far with increasingly diminished accuracy and power. Major Meredith, Sergeant McMurray, and Gunner O'Houlihan, and a Fox movie-tone cameraman, whose presence was noted by, but not explained to, reporters covering the scene, gathered their required supplies, equipment, kit, and 10,000 rounds of prepaid ammo, and stood by to board the train to take them to the Campion district by early October of 1932. And then it rained. The emus ran away for a month as the soldiers waited in Perth. As if that wasn't the biggest omen of what was to come so far. When the emus returned near the end of the month, the soldiers boarded a train for Burracoppin, the nearest train station near Walgoolan, where they were met on November 2nd by a crowd of excited farmers. From there, they and their weapons traveled by truck through most of the rabbit-proof fence towards the Campion district. While in transit, the men spotted a mob of 40 to 50 emus, and Meredith decided to begin the operation then and there. Noting that the birds were out of range, he asked some of the locals to circle around the emus in their own vehicles, driving the birds towards the soldiers and their machine guns. About 50 enthusiastic farmers did so, embarking upon several cars in a 20-mile circuit with a plan to herd the emus to a spot against the fence, where the animals would end up being trapped and vulnerable to the weapon's rapid fire. However, the emus, smarter than the soldiers or civilians expected, did not stampede in a straight line as many other animals do, but scattered in all directions when startled. So when the cars roared towards their position, they split into small groups and bolted, flapping their tiny wings, bodies bobbing this way and that way, while their muscular legs kicked up dust, swiftly tracing winding patterns through the scrub that limited agility of the pursuing cars that they could not hope to follow. The closest of the emus got within 1,000 yards of the guns, and although it was beyond their range, McMurray fired. The shots fell short and missed. Meredith asked the locals to repeat the same tactic, and again the caravan of cars with 50 or so local farmers traced its 20-mile route in an attempt to herd the emus toward the guns with very similar results. Despite being further away than before, McMurray opened fire and managed to down 6 of the birds. Thus, the first casualties of the Great Emu War of 1932 were recorded. 6 birds on day 1. A newspaper reported the results with high spirits and unchained optimism, saying Major Meredith showed how effective his Lewis gun was by mowing down half a dozen on the run at a range of 1,400 yards. On the following day, Meredith ordered that his men set up a base camp about 30 miles north of Waugulan, with operations concentrated primarily on the Perry, Joyce, and McGeorge farms in the area. Again, the soldiers spotted a herd of emus and, packing into trucks and accompanied by the 9 cars of cheering locals, stormed after the birds. They ended up killing 9, but only after the birds devastated a local farm. Observers noted that the emus were seeming to quickly learn, or already knew, the range limits of the machine guns, and would rarely venture within 1,000 yards of the men. Realizing the open warfare was simply ineffective against the wary emus, Meredith decided to employ ambushes in order to surprise the birds at short range. McMurray and O'Halloran therefore set up an ambush site on a dam overlooking a suitably tempting water source, and waited. After several hours, about 30 emus came within about 800 yards, and the men fired about 150 rounds, but inspecting the area, they discovered no bodies. Local farmers informed the soldiers that in addition to their speed and wariness, their dense bodies and thick feathers meant that the emus could absorb damage that would easily kill a regular person. They had been known to survive even after 5 or 6 direct hits. Nevertheless, the locals said there would be bound to be some wounded birds that would die later in the bush. Surely, they insisted, the soldiers must have scored some mortal hits. The affected birds just hadn't realized it yet. Meredith would later record that, quote, "The emu's resilience is more than astonishing. It's miraculous. If I had a division of men who could carry bullets like that, I could take on any army in the world." In the early morning of November 4th, O'Halloran set up at the dam again, and at sunrise a herd of about 100 emus headed straight for them. He opened fire at point-blank range, achieving complete surprise, but killing only 12 before his gun jammed. Meredith had sent away most of the locals, but some of the few remaining locals fired their rifles. Again, the emus scattered into small groups and zigzagged into the bush, evading damage. The soldiers waited for them at the dam for the remainder of the day, but no more emus returned. With 30 emus now dead, the soldiers with machine guns had finally surpassed the day 1 body count of stick-wielding local boys on bicycles. Incredible effort by the military. During this time, the Fox Movietone cameraman was with the group for at least part of the time. Footage from the beginning of the operation delivered to the public a propaganda reel showing the results as spectacular, optimistically proclaiming that, quote, "There will be no more damage done here for many a day to come," unquote. Still, photos of the time were remarkably generic, usually consisting of a single farmer displaying a single bird, or of 2 or 3 avian bodies against a fence. Print reporters began enthusiastic, but became more jaded and sarcastic toward the operation as the time went by, sometimes attributing human characteristics to the emus, saying, quote, "The emus had proved that they are not as stupid as they are usually considered to be. Each mob has its leader, always an enormous black-plumed bird standing fully 6 feet high, who keeps watch while his fellows busy themselves with the wheat. At the first suspicious sign, he gives the signal, and dozens of heads stretch out of the crop. A few birds might take fright, starting a headlong stampede for the scrub, the leader always remaining until his followers had reached safely." For the next few days, Meredith pursued rumors of a relatively large, tame flock of emus south of their position, but with little more success. At one point, they mounted one of their Lewis guns on the back of a flatbed truck and chased emus through the paddock at over 30 miles an hour. Gunner O'Halloran, clinging desperately to the back of the wildly bucking truck as it sped over uneven terrain, could not manage to discharge even a single shot. At one point, a local farmer simply tried running an emu down, but the doomed bird managed to entangle its corpse in the steering gear so that the truck ran fully off the road, excavating a large piece of the fence before finally coming to a stop. By November 8th, the men had used about a quarter of their allotted ammunition in pursuit of the birds. Reporters estimated that the men had killed approximately 200 emus, which was likely a generous number. Meredith insisted on 300, and the locals bragged about 500. But even assuming the highest number, the operation accounted for a 40th of the emu migration so far, and in the process, the panicking birds managed to stampede much of the remaining wheat into dust. Meredith, taking stock of the situation, praised the birds' speed and resilience, remarked to a local that an expansion of the operation would be justified, and helpfully pointed out to a reporter that, on the bright side, the mission had not suffered a single human casualty. Imagine that. You're fighting a guerrilla war against birds and losing. But, on the bright side, no one got pecked. Meanwhile, word had reached Canberra on the operations against the emus, and reporters asked Prime Minister Lyons for his views on the subject. Lyons, taken aback, promised to get answers. Soon, other MPs criticized the hunt, often equating its ridiculousness with the Lyons administration. Harold Thornby, MP for Clare in New South Wales, called it a farce, and after a Labour politician asked if there would be medals, a Western Australian MP replied that if there were, they should go to the emus. As the issue blossomed into a potential embarrassment, defense authorities, reluctant to set precedent, ordered Meredith that he and his machine guns withdraw from Campion by November 9th. Martin immediately relayed the orders to Meredith, who, after visiting 2 more paddocks, including Farmer Dixon's, and scouting another 30 miles of fence, dismissed reports of another major flock in the area and followed his orders by ultimately departing the Campion district later that day. The Perth Daily News reported on the withdrawal, saying, quote, "No treaty of peace had been concluded and the emus remain in possession of disputed territory. It is therefore expected that regular military operations will be followed by guerrilla warfare, which may continue for years and may be accompanied by stories of horrible atrocities. The emu commander is maintaining a studied silence to his future plans, but it is understood that he is much impressed with the capacity for resilience shown by raw troops, and confident that they will continue to uphold the best traditions of the race. He is credited with the intention to arrange for a suitable poem to commemorate the emu glory on the field of Campion." This also just shows the human side of all this ridiculousness. The emus were gaining traction with the locals in Australia, even so much that Emu Command, as they called it, was gaining support. The farmers immediately expressed their outrage at the withdrawal and pleaded for the return of the gunning crew. Pierce, still in Perth, received a desperate telegram that read, quote, "Gunners withdrawn. Imperative that they should stay. Emus beginning reappear in large numbers. Can you do anything? Wire me immediately. Dixon." The Great Southern Leader newspaper reported on November 11th that, quote, "experience was just beginning to reach a point where results could be expected." Western Australia Premier Sir James Mitchell, although a member of the Prime Minister's own party, also demanded that the party return to Campion, inflating the amount of damage caused in an effort to garner support. Ironically, and possibly unintentionally, he cited massive damage inflicted on the Perry, Joyce, and McGeorge farms, although much of that damage was likely caused by the guns themselves or the throng of accompanying cars and trucks. This local pressure caused Pierce to attempt to sway Canberra to allow Meredith's men to redeploy, but the Lyons administration literally did not return his calls. Left to his own devices, Pierce quoted reports that further inland drought was causing even more emus to flock to farmland, and that the birds were knocking down significant portions of the fence and letting in rabbits. Pierce decided that he could technically adhere to his orders by lending the machine guns to the Western Australian state government, rather than deploying them himself. And since Western Australian state government had no qualified gunners, he also lent them Meredith, McMurray, and O'Halloran. The letter of the law and chain of command thereby satisfied. The same force of 3 men once again boarded the train for Burracoppin, and then to the Campion district, arriving at the Joyce farm for a second time on November 13th. The second sojourn in the Campion district did not fare much better than the first. On the day of their arrival, the gunners set an ambush, but misestimated the range, and by the time they had change barrels to compensate, the emus once again scattered in their typical chaotic pattern, and the 2 men killed only 20 birds. On November 15th, the men tried switching to rifles and stalking the birds, to no avail. They then tried splitting their force of 3, deploying O'Halloran to the north as McMurray and Meredith headed south towards Wagulin. The latter 2 drove a herd of emus back toward and right over and overwhelmed O'Halloran's position. The animal welfare officer who accompanied the men admitted that he had little to do due to the birds' ability to continue to operate so well even after being grievously wounded. At some point, someone left a gate and the rabbit-proof fence open, allowing a good number of rabbits and emus alike to push into the supposedly protected interior before the gate was closed again. Pierce continued to defend the use of the machine guns, saying that he had at first thought that only a few had been killed, but later learned that the number was in the hundreds. By December 2nd, Meredith estimated that the men killed about 15 birds a day, and the expensive and embarrassing operation was finally recalled a second and final time on December 10th, 1932. In his final report, Meredith claimed that of the 9,860 rounds expended, the suspiciously easy divisible number of 986 birds had been killed. He also added that an additional 2,500 had later succumbed to their wounds, a calculation for which he provided no methodology. On December 13th, the farmers of the Campion district, further demoralized and disappointed by the campaign, finally agreed to load and sell their wheat. The agricultural bank delayed charging the still struggling farmers for the cost of the ammunition as long as its executors could justify, and when they finally asked for reimbursement, the locals steadfastly refused to pay. One soldier settler by the name of Daniel J. O'Leary stated that in a letter to the government actually owed him money to compensate for the time that he had spent killing wounded emus and for food, transport, and damage caused by cars ferrying around the overweight soldiers. In his letter, he referred to the mission commander as Major Murdereth. The Emu War had been a massive public relations debacle. Wheat Belt farmers continued to request machine gun crews in 1934, 1938, and 1943 as more Australian farms failed. In the latter of those requests, one petitioner suggests that the Australian military would be certain to have great effect against the emus if rather than machine guns, they began instead bombing emu flocks from the air. Eventually, the government reinstituted the bounty system, and between the years of 1945 and 1960, local farmers claimed bounties on over 284,000 emus. Today, the International Union for Conservation of Nature rates the emu as, quote, least concern. There are now more emus in Australia than there were when Europeans first landed. So what did we learn from the Great Emu War? Well, we learned the plight of struggling veterans, the failure of economic policy, nature's unpredictability, and the arrogance of military overreach. So if you don't get anything else from this episode of Naked History, it's that you should never start a land war in Western Australia against a bird that can run 30 miles an hour. And that has been this episode of Naked History. I'm Dylan Gasway, and thank you for joining me for this feathered fiasco. If you enjoyed today's episode, feel free to follow or subscribe and share this with one of your friends who thinks that they could take an emu in a fight, or a kangaroo, or really anything that Australia has that could kill you instantly. Next week on Naked History Debrief, we're going to be taking a behind-the-scenes look at the Great Emu War of 1932, including some of the footage that may have been lost to time, the camel patrols that were suggested by the farmers, and a few emu facts that even I didn't believe whenever I first read them. Until then, stay curious, stay weird, and if a bird gives you attitude, maybe just walk away. Thank you again for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.